is Miguel Gonzalez, and I'm a retirement counselor with over 20 years of experience helping clients in retirement income planning, overseeing investment of funds, and designing retirement plans. Let's talk about why investors should worry about stagflation. Slow economic growth, high unemployment, and rising inflation equals misery. On July 13, 2021, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics (BLS) reported that the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers increased 0.9% in June after rising 0.6% in May. Not only was this the largest one-month change since June 2008, but the Consumer Price Index has been up every month since January 2021. Maybe worse was that the BLS reported that over the last 12 months, the All Items Index increased 5.4%, the largest 12-month increase since a 5.4% increase for the period ending August 2008. Then 2 days later, the University of Michigan's gauge on consumer sentiment fell back to its lowest level since February, driven mostly by, you guessed it, inflation. So let's talk about inflation, hyperinflation, and stagflation. In simple terms, inflation is defined as the increase in the general level of prices for goods and services. Deflation, on the other hand, is defined as the decrease in general level of prices for goods and services. If inflation is high at, say, 10%, as it was in the 1970s, then a loaf of bread that costs $1 this year will cost $1.10 the next year. Inflation in the United States has averaged around 3.3% from 1914 until 2021, and it averaged about 3.7% for the past 60 years. For perspective, inflation reached an all-time high of 23.7% in June 2020 and a record low of negative 15.8% in June 2021. Many will remember the high inflation rates of the 70s and early 80s, when inflation hovered around 6% and occasionally reached double digits. Hyperinflation, by extension, is exactly what it sounds like: inflation that is increased at a supersonic speed. In technical terms, hyperinflation is defined as inflation that exceeds 50% per month. Although the U.S. has never experienced hyperinflation, other countries have. In fact, October 2019, the Internal Monetary Fund estimated Venezuela's annual inflation rate for 2019 would be an outstanding 200,000%. That's hyper. But while we are clearly in an inflationary period, it's unlikely that we're heading towards hyperinflation. But we might be headed towards something just as bad: stagflation. Let's talk about the risks of stagflation, as they're very real. The term stagflation was first used by UK politician Ian MacLeod in the 1960s when he was discussing current inflation that was accompanied by stagnation, calling it a stagnation situation. Stagflation is defined as a slow economic growth overall, high unemployment, and rising inflation. Some might combine the economic growth and the unemployment data into GDP and instead define stagflation as a period that sees declining GDP along with rising prices for inflation. The last time the US saw stagflation was in the 1970s, when we witnessed 5 quarters of negative GDP growth, inflation doubled in 1973, inflation hit double digits in 1974, and unemployment hit 9% in May 1975. This period of time also was led by the creation of the Misery Index. The Misery Index is an easy-to-understand measure of America's economic health, equal to the sum of inflation and the unemployment rate. The original Misery Index was created by Yale economist Professor Arthur Okun. In the 1960s, Professor Okun researched the relationship between unemployment and production, and his findings became known as Okun's Law, which states that when the U.S. unemployment falls by 1%, our gross national product will increase by 3%, which was apparently only true for the United States economy, and only when the unemployment was between 3% and 7.5%. Professor Okun also served on President Lyndon Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors, and he coined the Misery Index as a way for President Johnson to easily communicate the relative health of the U.S. economy. So the higher the index, the greater the misery felt by the average American. Pretty simple, right? But during the presidential campaigns of 1976 and 1980, the misery index became more popular. In the 1976, then-candidate Jimmy Carter criticized President Ford, and in 1980, then-candidate Ronald Reagan pointed out that the misery index increased under President Carter. For the most part, the misery index has been relegated to an abstract index for now. So, since the 1970s, the original misery index has been modified several times, including by Harvard economist Robert Barrow in 1999 and in 2011 by Johns Hopkins economist Steve Hanke. Barrow included much more data and it called it Barrow's misery index. And he included interest rates and economic growth and looked at other countries other than the United States. Hanke took Barrow's misery index and added more data, including the sum of the unemployment, inflation, bank lending rates, minus the percentage change in real GDP per capita. And yes, he called it Hanke's misery index and updates it yearly and it's close to 100 countries. Remember the 1970s. The truth is that there are consequences born from the coronavirus pandemic and resulting actions taken by the federal government and the Federal Reserve that are difficult to predict. But it should be no surprise that production would be negatively impacted as unemployed slowly rejoin the workforce and supply chains remain under severe pressure. As such, the risk that we will see slow economic output and higher unemployment as prices increase, inflation, the very definition of stagflation, is very real. One more thing. Did you know that the Dow Jones Industrial Average opened in 1970 at 809 points, and then 10 years later, December 1979, it closed at 839 points for almost no gain. And when adjusted for inflation, stock market investors lost 49% during the 1970s. Now that's misery. Once again, this is Miguel Gonzalez with Cortburg Retirement Advisors. Please take a moment to click the like icon and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel to receive our weekly video podcast every Monday morning. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all next week.